Hi, this is Martin Lawrence. You're listening to my man Dane Fitzgerald's Hype PodTube show. I agreed to do a little promo thingy for his show if he let me plug my new Bad Boys movie, Bad Boys Ride or Die, coming out Friday, June 7th in a theater near you. Check it out. Now on with the interview with Conrad Bastable.
What's the kind of trade-off is, right? Like the conceit on one side is that enforcing using state violence to minimize citizen violence against each other doesn't work. You can't do it, right? That's the make-believe idea that would be so wonderful if it were true, because it would mean it wouldn't even be practically good to use the state capacity for violence, because it could achieve nothing, right? In the same way that, like, I'm going to go off on a tangent, so on. But that would be wonderful. It just so happens that it's mostly empirically not true, although obviously there's nuance there, right? Maybe on the margins it doesn't do anything, but if you go from what San Francisco was doing in before Newsom's little crackdown to importing like 500 armed police and forcibly just, absolutely, I mean, it was crazy what he did to the city in like 2 weeks. If you do that, it turns out to empirically have a significant effect on direct kinds of crime that you're targeting, and then also all these other indirect crimes, right? Like, a lot of other things went down that were horrible crimes and that shouldn't be happening. And so then you're like, oh well, this is actually an interesting tension, because I don't want to be subject to state violence, right? Like, I would like to not live in a society that had to do that. And I know not everyone feels that way, but it's not particularly psychologically pleasant to be subjected to, you know, being shouted at by armed police who, could sort of end many parts of my professional career and or life if they were just, having a bad day in some way. And I'm sure none of them would, and everything's great. But what recourse would I have, right? So it doesn't feel great. And so you sort of have this very unpleasant, tragic, I think it really is tragic, trade-off that is sort of was made very real to me, where it's like, yeah, you can run Singapore, right? Like, you can run state violence and reduce crime, and it does work. And marginal policies, I'm sure you could do some sort of meta study of tests or whatever to try and find some way that it isn't true. But empirically speaking, at least in San Francisco, it worked pretty freaking well. But there's a cost to it. And like, do you want to live in that society forever? Yes or no? And most people in the elite professional class will say no. Like, I don't want to have to be subject to that. But then you've got the trade-off, and that kind of is there's the trade-off, right? It's there. It's apparent. They want you want to not have to live in a police state, but also you want to not have every possession you own be constantly robbed and burglarized. And
there's that phrase that I don't know if it's a phrase so much as a thought nugget, but if liberals don't do something about crime, fascists will, and so you want to get that, you want to make sure things that don't get so bad that people are willing to tolerate armed guards everywhere. We need to do something
yeah,
before it gets that bad.
I feel like that sort of stuff is like, it's like kind of like, I'm gonna maybe I'll alienate some people who follow me on Twitter, but I feel like that kind of stuff is like kind of edgy cope a little bit. And there's a flip side of that, which is the liberal position around wealth distribution and communist, right? It's like, if you don't pay your fair share of taxes, like, communists will make you pay them or something, right? And like,
Okay, is that
I
like, yeah,
think
it's kind of like the same idea from another direction?
it's
Yeah.
the exact, it's just inverted. And I think mostly in America it's not actually true, because the nature of and I'm not saying 400 years from now we won't go full, moron one way or another. But yeah, I think we have this sort of like we can in fact run you know, we can run milk toast versions of whatever you want forever, even down into like until things degrade, right? Whether if you're on the left, we could in fact run full corporatism in parts of this country forever with like limited redistribution, and like no amount of it will ever get the revolution that you want. I'm sorry, it's not coming. And on the flip side, you can live in San Francisco, and like we have our scenario, and there'll be people who will lobby for maybe policies that might be called right wing, but most might just look like build housing and maybe be a little tougher on crime, and it'll sort of work itself out in like a nuanced democratic iterative electoral process. And the median, it'll all just be downstream of whatever the median, I'm going to say voter, but really I mean citizen, and by citizen I mean sort of like the median citizen weight adjusted for the wealth generating effects that I mean in my essay, right? So like the Google employees who make $400,000 total compensation are overrepresented in how their beliefs translate to actual implemented policy, just simply because of the nature of the wealth effect. Which is to say, like, yeah, like I actually don't think there's any universe where like you get your glorious revolution or your like fascist police state. I just think things, even if that means like deteriorating into like strange and crazy levels of I mean, I don't know what could be stranger than the San Francisco treatment of like what's it called? What's it called? You break into cars and take stuff. It's not auto theft, right? It's I mean, it's literally a full time job for like many people in the city doing this,
Yeah,
and it's
very
every yeah,
robbery.
like but it's like its own niche, right? It's like B2B SaaS, but for a specific kind of criminal enterprise.
Yeah, that
And
the city is just has the weirdest dynamics. It almost does seem as if they tolerate. I mean, this is kind of well-worn territory. This kind of thinking here that they tolerate a good deal amount of crime because they themselves are doing well, and it's almost like they can sort of absolve their own wealth by just toughening up and saying, you know what, okay, fine, my Tesla was broken into, but so be it, or my e-scooter is missing. Oh well, I do pretty
yeah,
well. So like the
right.
better they do, the more they let those at the opposite end of their socioeconomic spectrum, get away with stuff.
And then what kind of philosophy do you adopt, right? Like you adopt a less materialistic philosophy. You're like, I only got 2 bikes stolen in San Francisco, right? I'm speaking personally here. Um, and there's that little comic that I put in the essay of the person who's like, well, I hope the person who has my bike enjoys it more than me. So maybe the net amount of like
Right.
utility's gone up
Yeah.
somewhat, right? So like you can adopt a less materialistic worldview that is like just so happens to be very coincident with what the general philosophy people tend to adopt as they get large amounts of wealth, right? Like it doesn't matter if you right if you want to start in the ancient period and you're like, okay, it just so happens that like the Buddha was a wealthy elite, right? Or you can go to the modern era and look at like how many Twitter threads do you see like that they get printed every month? It's like, after I became a millionaire at 30, I realized that like my real passion was like health and traveling the world, or like enjoying like time with my friends or whatever. It's like after they got lots of money, they were free now to like not care about material things. As if this is like some great spiritual revelation and not like the sort of very natural response to getting lots of money. Um,
Yeah, I admit that I seems like a just so story to me. Not what you're saying exactly, but just this idea that, well, let's say you're pursuing art history. Well, that's probably a good sign that you come from money and you're basically comfortable. I'm pretty sure the vast majority of people who pursue that are not actually some kind of elite.
yeah,
Just
what's the Johns Adams
they could
quote?
be
That's like,
mistaken about how successful they'll be, but they're not doing some kind of knowing, going the other way, moving away from wealth generation just to show how much more spiritual and sophisticated I am. I don't think that's what they're doing.
Yeah, there's the John Adams quote that's like, "What's I study war so my son can study economics, so his son can study art or something," right? Like that's kind of the nature of society. But then, yeah, even on the civilizational lens, if you just view what we're doing as like a even a mild community exercise in society, whether your community is your family or a bigger group, right? Like if you stop, if you're not interested in progress, in making more with less, then like, yeah, it's all of a sudden you can have these other beliefs, and that's great. It's fine, and yeah,
Yeah, they're
and
just
it works for
just too
people,
many
right?
people in junior college pursuing art and Middle Eastern history or something.
But if they want to, like, go for it, right? Like
Yeah,
if
yeah, I mean,
they're
I
able
don't
to,
think.
and the banks will give them $200,000 loans to do it, and like great, like if that's what they want to do, great, right?
Yeah, so I kind of oscillate on this, giving succor to materialist analyses. You took a materialist approach to San Francisco in some way. I
Hmm.
mean, it's not like economically materialist straightforwardly, but it's somewhere between the kind of social psychology or
Yeah,
personality
yeah, yeah,
types and
exactly.
areas.
I'm basically saying all of the non-materialist stuff is incredibly important and super relevant, and then all of that is downstream of materialist factors.
Right, because one materialist take or a take on San Francisco that would seem to completely reject the kind of classic materialism of a kind of wealth generating capitalist acquisitive census. Why is there so much tolerance for crime in San Francisco given how expensive that real estate is? If we're thinking of it in kind of straightforward, I got mine economic materialism, they would be cracking skulls all over the place. But clearly something has happened. There's a kind of self-deprecating guilt-based cultural force at work that cuts against protecting the wealth of that very wealthy city.
Yeah, which happens to be the same exact culture that the people have in, middle school, who end up acing all the marshmallow tests, and it's just like
Yeah,
this is my view, obviously, right? It's like it's just a selection funnel. You're just selecting people.
right. The naive view, I would guess that if someone is themselves capable of restraint, they would have very little tolerance for those who lack restraint. But in fact, we see the opposite.
No,
Uh,
it tends to be. I mean,
although
so
you
do
do
you
say
know
in their own social circles they would not tolerate it. You'd be
exactly?
persona grata, right?
Yeah, like do you know the he hasn't written anything for a decade, but there was this essayist called The Last Psychiatrist. I don't
Oh
know if
yeah,
you've heard
I
of him.
remember that from the golden age of blogging. I kind of remember that. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So anyway, he wrote this thing 20 plus, or no, 10, 15 years ago.
Wow.
And he's talking about the same factor. And he puts it very bluntly in a way that's like very unpleasant. I'm trying to think if I can even quote it in ways that like don't make me seem awful just from quoting it. But he says something like, oh, here's the quote. He's like, the sad logical retort to this comes from a place of compassion, though when I write this out explicitly, it just sounds like classism. Quote, it's best just to back down from them because that's the way thems are. And like that kind of is the psyche that you experience when you encounter, and it's the mode mentally that you adopt when you're in a system that like, okay, if I don't get involved in the system, I will print, generational wealth for my children and my family. Like, okay, I'll back down from this conflict, whatever. I'm just gonna not get involved in it, right? And I don't mean to defend the quote, and it is classist and whatever, but like when you talk about like crackdown or whatever, it's like it comes from a place of compassion. It's very true that it does, but it also does not view, as you said, like you even said, like if for somebody who was capable of restraint, right? Like implicit in that is the other person is not capable of restraint, and therefore what? Like that they are somehow different, right? And that's it's interesting because I actually almost would be happy to challenge that, like the inherent classism of that view at length. Like I was listening to this. I'm going to change tack here, real real hard. But I was listening to this rap song that just came out recently this weekend, and the first line of it is, "People always pick and choose depending on whether or not they think you're willing to." And like I actually think part of what I was trying to get at in my escalation theory essay was a bit of a repudiation of that view that those people aren't capable of it, um, and to try and not capable of restraint, and to try and shine some light perhaps on a very different way of looking at the world, where some of these people they're always running a calculation in their head, like, is this person who I'm seeing across the street from me or across the playground from me, are they willing to escalate conflict if I get involved with them? And actually, like that whole mental cycle that they run, and I'm using the word they, but like obviously I'm somewhat familiar with it, is a mental cycle that implicit in it is restraint. Actually, like the person is capable of restraint, but the axis of restraint is not a teacher or a policeman or a society. It's just, is that person going to escalate on me in a way that could have repercussions? Um, anyway, just another interesting view.
Yeah. So for the last part of this, I kind of want to pivot to the notion of San Francisco as a kind of city at the end of history, and by that I mean the city that is working to make being in any particular city not important. Just because it's facilitation of virtual experiences. The way it kind of the way San Francisco came down on itself essentially amid COVID. Um,
Mhm.
I feel like there's something happening there. There was an article in Compact last year called the Tech Detroit, or the Detroit of Tech. It
Yeah.
turns out that I mean, San Francisco's kind of rebounded a little bit with the cerebral valley and all that stuff. And so I think that's probably overblown, but there's something to this idea of a city that maybe is slowly coming undone and hollowing itself out, and yet is more powerful than ever. So I don't know. What do you think about that notion of a tech Detroit, or some kind of virtual life, permanently online thing, ultimately undoing any kind of regionalism or importance of being in a particular city?
Yeah. Um, Look, I think there's an essay in my folder that I've been kicking around for a long time called, like, the Thousand Rust Belts of America. I think actually this whole country is
It was
full of
called the
rust belts.
Tech
We can
Rust
only
Belt.
think of
Tech
one.
Rust Belt. Right. That was the name of
Yeah.
the article. Apparently, the Rust Belt is restricted to one city, though, so the metaphor doesn't quite work, or the analogy.
Yeah, but no, but I think it really does. Like, I do a lot of I drive all over New England, and there are New England itself is sort of this exact same thing. Is there's these mill towns that were just the center of national economic productivity 200 years ago, and they are completely hollowed out shells of themselves, and it's depressing and as all hell to drive through. And it's the same. Obviously, I've driven all through the Midwest as well, right? I think a couple things. So on the remote work and virtualization stuff, I'm probably less bullish than I would have been a few years ago. I think there are just so many factors at play that regionalize and centralize some of the flows of capital, especially in technology. The case for San Francisco to become a true Rust Belt would not be virtual work to me. It would be the decline of the internet and tech sector entirely, in the same way that the cotton mill sector no longer exists, and or that the U.S. car industry as a share of global productivity is uh, a shell of itself, and the unions are like whatever. Um, just because I think the all of the factors at play are net, most of them are on the side of centralizing the tools for productivity, as in even if you could virtualize the whole thing, right? Like, why is so much of finance centralized in a couple cities, right? Like, you can do most of it from home as long as you have a fast enough internet connection, and yet most of this stuff actually has tended to always be somewhat centralized. And yeah, people fly in, fly out. I'm sort of a quasi remote worker myself, right? Like, I split my time, but yeah, I think it won't actually rust belt itself unless the what would the metric be? It would be like the startup ecosystem basically dies, big tech ossifies 30 years from now into a handful of 4 or 5 companies. They lay off most of their workforce, or at least stop growing, which is usually how it works. You just stop growing, and something like that. It would all be very horrible. But it's believing in that worldview is just like such a pessimistic framing for what the tech sector is, that it's very hard to. I mean, I wouldn't write any checks on it. I just like the technology sector is one of the few sectors of this country that's like economically grown over the last sort of post Great Recession, and I expect that to continue. And if that's going to continue, then the gains to centralizing labor and capital in the same place are very high, which is not to say that you can't be incredibly productive and wealthy and generate value from elsewhere, right? And more people than ever have been experiencing that. But things
Yeah,
will
and
tend to
this kind of
centralize.
gets back to the difference between the information sector and the kind of extractive sectors. Rust Belt is famously extractive, not really like coal or something like that, in the sense that you could manufacture cars in a lot of places. You don't have to be near a place where cars naturally appear or anything, but still, tech is able to be much more have much more dexterity and kind of move into places such that it survives in a way that companies relying on materials often nearby, at least to supplement the core product.
Yeah, I
Simply
mean,
not gonna
there
happen
is
here.
just so much, not to use a cheesy military metaphor, but there is so much friction to the process of building something valuable in this country where friction is some of the lowest in the world. Like there is just so much organizational, institutional friction to doing things. And I think it's very hard for people who aren't involved in the process of building companies and growing them to fully understand how just spiritually and sort of philosophically and empirically crushing it can be to truly try and build something that's growing and that's able to grow. It is, I mean, there's a reason everyone gets gray hair from doing the process. It is incredible. There's so much friction, and anything you do that can increase that friction is it like 5x is the chance of your organization dying and or being co-opted and sort of skin suited and just extracted, have all the value extracted from it. So yeah, even if like the value of co-locating or centralizing, I like the word centralizing a lot. Capital and labor is even if it's less of a value add than it was 10 years ago, it still reduces friction. And I mean, reducing friction there's so much. It looks easy from the outside, but building companies is not smooth. Even when it goes quickly, everything breaks and everyone breaks, and there's just friction. And I think as long as you believe in technology, then you should believe in San Francisco and the Bay Area, even if it happens to look like it's falling apart at any given point in time.
Yeah, if we're going to talk about Bay Area falling apart, it's actually much more specifically East Bay. I mean, Oakland has been clearly in decline. Its teams are leaving, and even its professional sports teams, that is. And there's other evidence of it being on the downslide, but its proximity to San Francisco will keep it from ever becoming anything like a Detroit, although it might feel different on the ground. I don't know.
Yeah, yeah, maybe it'll be like New York and New Jersey or something, right?
Right.
Um,
Yeah. Oakland has like the Newark or the Hoboken or something like that.
yeah, yeah,
Um,
yeah. I'm very very cynical, but at my heart, I'm an optimist. It's the duality of man.
yeah. Yeah. I think it's interesting the way that, I mean, the engines of growth or the sectors that are increasingly responsible for most wealth generation are over time moving away from the typical person's instincts for what a business even does. I mean, so they understand putting together a car. You look at like the big companies of the mid-century. I don't know. Yeah, Ford, GM, Kodak. They all do something that we can kind of more easily comprehend. And tech just becomes it's increasingly esoteric, and also it doesn't have the head count. It doesn't need as many merely warm bodies to partake in that kind of industry. So I think that's basic. That's part of why people kind of look down on and are suspicious of the tech sector. It just
Yeah,
looks
like
to be
the
like
thing that
wizards.
always like stumps me is the tech sector just had the worst sort of 18-month period uh since the 2000 .com bust, and yet the absolute localized recession that happened did not spill over into the general economy. To the extent that if you, I don't want to argue with the government's numbers, right? Like there was not really a national collapse. It was just a hyper focused, regionalized on this one industry in a way that other big industries that dominate, right? Like tech dominates the U.S. stock market, right? Like in terms of like
Right.
market cap value, right? Like it's all tech, and yet the industry can explode for 18 months and just absolutely, it was just awful working, and everyone knows people who got laid off, and yet, yeah, it turns out there is no national recession just because, as you say, the reason it's valuable is because it doesn't need many people. And it's the same thing in finance, right? And um, and I do even as you say that, right? Like you're like, hey, it's the industry is what did you say? You said it's harder to understand or something like that, right? Than building a
Yeah, it's
car. It's not as
esoteric,
intuitive.
it does
Esoteric, yeah.
it doesn't naturally do better with more people in a way that other industries might, and the things that easily come to mind. All hands on deck, everyone pitch in to build this
Yeah.
levee along the river. It's not anything like that. It can do more with less. The head count can lessen, and it can still generate even more wealth. That doesn't comport with our instincts very well.
I think if anyone listens to this who works in tech, they might think like, "Oh yeah, that maps to how my family members think about what I do." But me working in it, I get it, and obviously I suspect that is true, and many people do get it. But I do think like the the way that it's that all of the value is kind of removed from what we do is it does creep up on you. I was speaking with a really wonderful friend recently, and we were having an argument about all the great parts of economics that I love to argue about. And they were condemning another industry or another player in our industry for being what's the word, like rent extractors, basically, right? And
Yeah.
I sort of like I put to them that the only reason, when we make profits and we make margin, what's the difference on an economic standpoint between those profits that your company makes and the profits that someone else's makes that you think of as rent? And people to stacks, and I can maybe on a nuance level I'll concede, but most of what passes for value creation is also tied up with value capture. And that's like, that's this core Telian insight that is contrary to the spirit that you learn from Adam Smith in Microeconomics
Yes,
101 and then thenceforward forever, right? And you're
that's a
like,
great point. I
yeah,
think
but
that's part of why we've seen the demise of the term crony capitalism, because of there's sort of this new realism about capitalism just frankly being crony, if you will. But that's just what you do. That's how you become a success. You want to become a monopoly and so forth. I think he
yeah,
does.
I mean, whether or not you have cronies is a thing that should probably be looked into, and I'm all about cracking down on the cronies, but the heart of capitalism is value capture. This is the teal point, and it's like Adam Smith is a wonderful academic, and I love all of his ideas, but like I'm here to make a surplus. Actually, that is actually the goal. That is the point of business.
Well,
And
aside
the
from that,
government
he was
taxes
also
us.
enamored of the labor theory of value. So he has his
Yeah,
flaws.
look, I mean, no one's perfect, right? I mean, but I would not hold that against. I would never hold an academic's uh, things that are later challenged against their wonderful insights, right? None of us are perfect, and I hope other people extend me the same courtesy. But like
I
at the
think
end of the day, uh, the whole point is of business is to build a surplus, and if you do a wonderful job, Uncle Sam comes and just grabs a bunch of taxes from you at the end of the day, right? And then these companies try and hide the taxes using the way the tax code is written and right, and like you can argue all this stuff, but like the whole point is to build value and capture value, and to do it in ways that are fair. And like I think tech is so wonderful because if you're in the right kind of tech, doing the right kind of industry and the right kind of value add, you can capture some portion of the value you create without your customers going like, hang on a minute, are you screwing me over? Because you just capture less than you create. Whereas a lot of other industries, there is not enough margin involved in the process to like there's only one slice of pie left, basically, right? And like either we get it or they get it. Whereas in a lot of tech, you're able to, at least today in this market, and if you have a good company, you can create a big enough slice of pie, and then you can split it with your customer. And I think that's wonderful because it means we get some surplus too. And the way you figure out who gets the portion and who gets what portion, like that's all leverage. It's why the thing was called political economy. It's just deciding where the slice goes, and there are a lot of economics and business reasons to decide it one way or another. You know, I think it's a fun game. I think
Yeah, I
it's also
believe that the
rewarding.
discipline was political economy before it became just economics or just politics.
Right, because politics is ultimately it just means how things get apportioned between the polity, right? Like the
Right.
the, the point
There's
is who gets what
for
share.
years I was involved in this kind of almost autistic market purism debates where they try to finally tease out what is crony capitalism, what is not, and it just seems like it's gotten too murky. to really say with much confidence that this thing is purely capitalism or not. We've sort of settled on it. We know it when we see it. There's just capitalism, crony or otherwise. But it is what it is. And
Are you familiar with this idea? Like this, it became popular in the last decade. The whole like nudge theory thing. I realize it seems like a tangent, but I'm gonna link it back. That like like nudge, public
yeah, that was
communication.
actually that's actually what got me to kind of deviate from libertarianism. And I actually consider that part of what put me down a road somewhat to post-liberalism, although, the post-liberals are doing something much headier than that and much more philosophical. But, there's kind of, attacking the notion of human rationality. I know that a lot of those papers have been replicated or whatever, and that, there's been some criticism there, but I still think a lot of that kind of holds in my
Yeah.
mind.
So like, and for people who aren't, it's just sort of this change in tack of how public communication is done. Is instead of like broadcasting pure, just like the I don't even know how to put it. Basically, you just sort of give a lot of small nudges to the populace at large with messaging to try and get them to take the right course of action instead of making it very transparent and clear and like uh, interpretable by a rational mind. You just kind of nudge people a lot. It's became popular in the last decade or two, whatever. Anyway, I think there's I mention it because obviously it's interesting on its own merit, but I think a huge portion of how people engage, people of a certain kind, engage with economics, especially societal economics, and not the economics of their own business, but like what is the right thing we should do for the nation, right? Economics is this sort of nudge theory framework of economics, right? And I think it's interesting thing, right? Like people want there's some outcome that people want that is not they don't believe it's necessarily inherently produced by capitalism. And when I say people here, I'm referring to sort of like a broad union between everyone from neoliberals to libertarians to neocons. Basically, no matter what side of the aisle on, as long as like you went through microeconomics 1 and macroeconomics 1 at like the college level and you agreed with it, right? Like you were like, yes, economics is legit and making things is good, right? If you went through that process and then you went off into the world and developed your own takes and perspectives and got your experience, you sort of come back to a lot of things from a how can we nudge society's businesses into doing what we want? And I have I find the to the extent that like nudge theory has taken some beatings in the public communications department, I feel like it has not taken enough in the economics department.
Yeah, there were some. I wouldn't go all in on defending lots of specific claims there, but I think it's sort of core insights help, sort of disabuse me of certain naive, kind of libertarian leaning capitalist notions.
I'm all good with the nudge stuff as well, and but I think on the economics, what I'm really getting at is this idea that um, companies exist to do sort of like sinful um, inherently sinful profit generating activity, and then we need to nudge them via some combination of policy and communication into doing good for society. I think that's kind of the link that I was trying to draw in that kind of take. um, and it comes down and it touches many such topics, right? Like I love arguing with the NIMBY debate a lot. And people have this framework of like we can nudge developers by just concocting incentives a little bit, blah blah blah. And I I find it a little bit exhausting, mostly because I think the people who are trying to the core conceit of it all is that the people who are doing the nudging are more capable than the people doing the building, and I find that rarely to be the case.
Yeah, that gets into the kind of uh, area of epistemology and are the experts better poised to make decisions? But I think there is some kind of low hanging fruit on just simple designs. Um,
Yeah, me too. Me too. Very
Perhaps
low hanging fruit
perhaps
on
I mean a
very
lot of it
simple
is just
design. No
obvious,
nudging needed.
right? I
Yeah.
mean, if someone were to say, we should go ahead and allow slot machines in all Nevada schools because they're already in the gas stations. You know, I don't think you could say, you know what, we shouldn't do that because of the knowledge problem. You never know. Someone might actually have a good reason to not do that, or a good reason to use the slot machine. They have a certain circumstance. You don't know. You know, they use this pretense of knowledge argument when this most straightforward answer is, of course, we shouldn't do that because we shouldn't encourage gambling. You know, I think some
Right.
of the knowledge problem stuff, I think it's, you know, used to the point of abuse in a way that just basically satisfies a kind of small business philosophy or capitalism come what may. I think it's a little self-serving. Yeah. Okay. Well, I'll wrap it up now. Thanks, Conrad.
Yeah. It's just gone about to be 5:30 here.
Oh, okay.
Great. Well, yeah,
Right.
give me a ping.
Cool.
I'll reshare it to my my email list as well. So
Take care.
thanks a lot, man. Appreciate it.